Picture this, it's the year 1400 after Christ. While Europeans are just beginning to dream of lands beyond the ocean, in the vast American Southwest, something extraordinary is happening. The Apache people are emerging into this landscape like smoke from sacred fires, and they're about to become something that will confound military minds for the next 5 centuries. Now, when I say emerging, I don't mean they just showed up out of nowhere. These weren't newcomers stumbling around lost in the desert. The Apache had been moving south from what we now call Canada for generations, part of the Great Athabascan migration that had been flowing like a slow river across the continent. But it's around 1400 that they truly arrived in the Southwest, not just geographically, but spiritually, becoming one with a land that would forge them into the most elusive warriors in American history. And what a land it was. Imagine trying to describe the American Southwest to someone who's never seen it. You've got towering mesas that rise from the desert floor like ancient skyscrapers, their red sandstone walls glowing like fire in the setting sun. Hidden canyons slice through the earth so deep and narrow that high noon feels like twilight at the bottom. Vast deserts stretch to horizons that shimmer with heat, where the temperature can swing 60 degrees between noon and midnight. Hot enough to kill you during the day, cold enough to do the same job 12 hours later. This wasn't just scenery to the Apache. This landscape became their greatest teacher, their most powerful ally, and ultimately their secret weapon. Every shadow, every rock formation, every seemingly barren stretch of sand held lessons that would take a lifetime to learn and generations to master. Apache children, and this is where things get really interesting, didn't learn to survive in this environment. They learned to become part of it. From their earliest memories, these kids understood that every shadow could hide a warrior. Every rock formation could conceal an entire band, and every apparently lifeless stretch of desert held secret water sources known only to those who truly belonged to the land. The training these children underwent would seem impossible to modern minds. Boys as young as 4 years old, began conditioning that would make Navy SEAL training look like summer camp. They would run up mountains with mouthfuls of water they couldn't swallow, learning breath control so perfect that even dogs couldn't hear them approach. Can you imagine that? A 4-year-old learning to move so silently that a dog, an animal whose hearing is exponentially better than ours, couldn't detect him. They practiced becoming invisible in broad daylight, learning to use shadows and terrain features to disappear completely while standing just feet away from observers. Young Apache warriors could lie motionless for hours in positions that would leave most adults cramping and cursing, waiting for the perfect moment to move. They memorized the location of every spring, every cave, every game trail across territories that spanned hundreds of square miles. The Apache weren't a single unified tribe. They divided into several distinct groups, each mastering their own territories with knowledge passed down through countless generations. You had the Chiricahua in the mountains of southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. The Mescalero claimed the mountain and desert country around what's now the New Mexico-Texas border. The Jicarilla controlled the high country of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and the western Apache spread across the mountains and deserts of central and western Arizona. Each group developed their own specialties, their own intimate relationship with their particular slice of this harsh paradise. The Chiricahua became masters of the Rocky Mountain strongholds. The Mescalero perfected the art of desert survival. The Jicarilla learned to thrive in high-altitude terrain that would challenge mountain climbers today. But they all shared something fundamental. They all understood that the land itself was alive, that it would protect and provide for those who knew how to listen to its voice. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered Apache warriors in the early 1600s, they wrote fevered reports back to Mexico City that read like science fiction. These Spanish soldiers were veterans of European wars, men who had conquered the Aztec Empire, fighters who considered themselves among the best in the world. And they were absolutely terrified. They described warriors who seemed to possess supernatural powers, appearing and disappearing at will like desert mirages. Apache raiders would strike packed mule trains carrying silver from Mexican mines, then vanish before soldiers could even load their muskets. Pursuit parties would follow clear tracks across rocky ground, only to have those tracks simply end, as if the warriors had sprouted wings and flown away. One Spanish report described finding a camp where Apache cookfires were still warm, bedrolls, still held the impression of sleeping bodies, but every living soul had vanished without a trace. The soldiers searched for hours, increasingly nervous, knowing they were being watched but unable to locate a single enemy. Then, as the sun began to set, arrows started falling from the sky like deadly rain, shot by invisible archers who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. What the Spanish didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that Apache warriors hadn't developed magic. They had created something far more powerful and far more dangerous. They had built a complete system of warfare based on becoming one with their environment, where the land itself became their weapon. These weren't just hit-and-run tactics or clever ambushes. This was something entirely new in warfare. An entire people who had learned to make themselves indistinguishable from the landscape they defended. When Apache warriors moved through their territory, they weren't traveling across the land. They were flowing with it, like water finding its natural course. And this was just the beginning, because in the centuries to come, this mysterious ability to vanish would be tested against increasingly desperate enemies. First, the Spanish with their armor and horses, then the Mexicans with their superior numbers, and finally, the Americans with their modern weapons, their West Point-trained officers, and their absolute confidence that no primitive warriors could stand against the might of a civilized army. Those generals were in for quite a surprise. The 1850s brought a new kind of enemy to Apache lands. American soldiers, fresh from victory in the Mexican War, marching west with the kind of confidence that only comes from crushing organized armies in set-piece battles. These weren't Spanish conquistadors fumbling around in unfamiliar territory. These were professional soldiers trained at West Point, armed with the latest rifles, supported by cavalry and artillery, and absolutely certain that their modern weapons and European-style military doctrine would quickly subdue what they dismissed as primitive raiders. They couldn't have been more catastrophically wrong. When Lieutenant George Bascom arrested Cochise's relatives in 1861 over stolen cattle the chief knew nothing about, he set in motion events that would confound the United States Army for the next 25 years. But here's what makes this story so extraordinary. Cochise wasn't some untrained savage reacting in blind rage. He was a strategic genius who understood exactly what kind of war he was about to fight. And he had been preparing for it his entire life. Cochise transformed the Dragoon Mountains into something the Americans had never encountered, an invisible fortress. From hidden camps scattered throughout seemingly impassable peaks, his 600 warriors could monitor every movement of thousands of soldiers below while remaining completely undetected themselves. American generals would stare up at those towering rock formations through their field glasses, seeing nothing but barren stone, while Apache scouts watched their every move, from positions sometimes just yards away. The Americans discovered that everything they thought they knew about warfare was useless in this landscape. Their carefully drawn maps, the pride of army cartographers, might as well have been blank paper. What appeared on those maps as impassable cliff faces contained hidden trails that Apache families had used for generations. What seemed like barren rock concealed springs that could sustain warriors for months. Valleys that looked empty from a distance held complex networks of caves and overhangs, where entire bands could shelter, invisible from above, but the Apaches didn't. Just know the terrain. They had developed communication. Networks that put the Army's much-vaunted telegraph system to shame. Using mirror flashes during the day and carefully placed fires at night, Apache signal stations could relay information across hundreds of miles faster than any Army dispatch rider. A troop movement spotted at dawn near Tucson could be known to every Apache band, from the Dragoons to the Chiricahuas, by sunset. During one pursuit in 1870, General George Crook, considered one of the Army's finest Indian fighters, watched in absolute disbelief as Apache warriors his own Apache scouts swore were cornered in a box canyon, simply vanished into thin air. The soldiers spent hours searching every crevice, every boulder, convinced the Apaches had to be hiding somewhere. It wasn't until days later that Crook learned the truth. The Apache warriors, along with their women and children, had climbed what soldiers considered impossible cliff faces in complete darkness, their bare feet finding holes that experienced mountaineers would have needed ropes and pitons to navigate. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about a few desperate warriors making a last-ditch escape. Entire families, grandmothers, mothers carrying babies, children barely old enough to walk, had scaled vertical rock faces in the dark that would challenge modern rock climbers with all their specialized equipment. And they did it silently, in a matter of hours, leaving no trace behind. The Apaches perfected psychological warfare techniques that the Army manual had no chapter for. They created false camps, leaving just enough signs, a few cold ashes, some scattered horse droppings, footprints leading in obvious directions, to convince Army trackers they were hot on the trail. Meanwhile, the real Apache band might be 50 miles away, watching through telescopes as frustrated soldiers wasted days following phantom trails. They cached water in hidden clay jars buried across thousands of square miles of desert, creating supply networks that allowed them to travel routes that would kill pursuing cavalry from thirst. Apache warriors could cover 70 miles a day on foot through terrain that reduced mounted soldiers to a crawl. Appearing at waterholes the Army didn't even know existed. Most devastatingly, they learned to fight the Americans' minds as much as their bodies. Apache raids followed no pattern the military mind could grasp. They might strike a remote ranch, kill the livestock, but spare the family. Attack a patrol, disable all the horses, but let the soldiers walk home. Leave mutilated animals as calling cards while treating prisoners with unexpected mercy. One day they would fight like demons. The next, they would melt away without firing a shot. This randomness wasn't random at all. It was calculated to create a constant state of anxiety that broke men's nerves more effectively than bullets. Soldiers began jumping at shadows, shooting at rocks they thought were moving, reporting Apache warriors everywhere and nowhere. One officer wrote home that fighting Apaches was like boxing with ghosts. Every time you thought you had them, your fists hit empty air. The Army tried everything. They built a network of forts across Apache country, only to discover that Apaches could move between them at will, often using routes that passed within sight of the stockades. They employed Apache scouts against their own people, creating agonizing divisions within Apache society, but also proving that only Apaches could catch Apaches, and even then, only sometimes, they imported tracking dogs from the east, animals that could follow a week-old trail through any terrain. The Apaches countered by doubling back on their own tracks, walking through streams for miles, and using aromatic plants to confuse the dog's sense of smell. Some Apache warriors learned to walk backwards in their own footprints, making it impossible to determine which direction they had traveled. The frustration was driving Army officers to distraction. These were men who had fought in the Civil War, who understood siege warfare and cavalry charges and artillery bombardments. But how do you lay siege to an enemy who has no fixed position? How do you charge warriors who aren't there when you arrive? How do you use your artillery advantage against fighters who attack and vanish before you can even unlimber the guns? General William Tecumseh Sherman, the man who had marched through Georgia leaving a trail of destruction 60 miles wide, admitted that Apache warfare was unlike anything he had ever encountered. "We have been at war with these people for 20 years, he wrote, "and we know less about them now than when we started. But the most maddening thing for the army wasn't the tactical defeats or the strategic frustration. It was the growing realization that they were facing an enemy who seemed to possess capabilities that defied rational explanation. How else could you account for warriors who could disappear from open ground under direct observation? Who could move through terrain without leaving tracks? Who seemed to know the army's plans before the army made them? The truth was both simpler and more complex than the supernatural explanations some soldiers whispered around their campfires. The Apaches hadn't developed magic powers. They had developed something far more dangerous. They had created a way of war that made the landscape itself their ally, where centuries of accumulated knowledge gave them advantages no amount of West Point training could overcome. And just when the army thought things couldn't get any worse, they were about to meet a Chiricahua warrior whose name would become synonymous with the impossible. In 1885, a Chiricahua warrior named Geronimo led 35 fighters, including women and children, off the San Carlos Reservation and into what military historians still consider one of the most remarkable guerrilla campaigns ever conducted. For over a year, this tiny band would evade 5,000 American troops and 3,000 Mexican soldiers while covering thousands of miles of the most inhospitable terrain in North America. Let me put those numbers in perspective for you. Imagine trying to find 35 people hiding somewhere in an area the size of Texas and New Mexico combined. Except this area is filled with mountains, deserts, and canyons that offer infinite hiding places. Now imagine those 35 people know every waterhole, every hidden trail, every cave and overhang across that entire territory. And imagine they can move faster on foot than you can on horseback. General Nelson Miles, who commanded the final campaign against Geronimo, called it the most difficult Indian campaign in the history of the United States Army. Coming from a man who had fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, that was quite an admission. What made Geronimo's resistance so extraordinary wasn't just the overwhelming odds. It was how Apache tactics made those odds completely meaningless. Traditional military thinking holds that you concentrate superior force at the decisive point. But what happens when there is no decisive point? What happens when your enemy refuses to fight the kind of battle your superior numbers are designed to win? Geronimo's warriors could cover 70 miles in a day on foot through mountains that reduced cavalry to a crawl. They knew the location of every hidden spring across a territory larger than New England, knowledge gained through generations of careful observation and passed down through sacred stories that served as both spiritual teachings and survival manuals when cornered, and the army thought. They had cornered Geronimo dozens of times. His warriors employed techniques that seemed to violate the laws of physics. They would scatter in different directions, running full speed through terrain soldiers could barely walk through, then reunite days later at predetermined locations that might be 100 miles away. How do you pursue an enemy in 8 different directions when you only have one column of troops? Geronimo used the international border between Mexico and the United States like a magician uses misdirection. His band would strike targets in Arizona, then slip across into Mexico before American forces could respond. When Mexican troops moved to intercept them, they would dance back across the border into American territory. The two governments tried to coordinate their efforts, but Geronimo moved faster than diplomacy. And then there were the Apache women who proved every bit as formidable as the men. Lozan, Geronimo's spiritual advisor and one of his most trusted warriors, possessed what Apaches called power, an ability to sense enemies miles away by holding out her hands and feeling for a tingling sensation that grew stronger in the direction of danger. Skeptics can dismiss this as superstition, but Lozan's warnings saved the band from discovery so many times that even hardened warriors who had seen everything never questioned her guidance. The army tried employing Apache scouts against their own people, creating agonizing moral divisions within Apache society. Families were split, with brothers fighting on opposite sides. But even this advantage, using Apaches to catch Apaches, proved frustratingly inadequate. The scouts could follow Geronimo's trail, could predict some of his movements, but they couldn't think like him. They had been trained by the army to fight like soldiers, while Geronimo still fought like a force of nature. Time after time, the army thought they had him. Troops would surround a canyon at dawn, certain that Geronimo's band was trapped inside, only to discover cold ashes and tracks leading impossibly up sheer rock faces. Or they would find camps that had been abandoned minutes before their arrival, coffee still warm, blankets still holding body heat. But every Apache would be gone as if they had simply evaporated. One of the most incredible escapes happened during a winter storm, when Geronimo's band was completely surrounded on a mesa top with no apparent way down. The army waited out the storm, confident that when morning came they would finally have their prize. At dawn they stormed the mesa to find nothing. Fresh snow should have shown tracks in any direction, but there were none. It wasn't until days later that they discovered how Geronimo had done it. His people had walked backwards in their own footprints during the heaviest part of the storm, completely confusing any trail signs, while making it appear that tracks led up to the mesa, but none led away. The psychological impact on American forces was devastating. Soldiers began seeing Apaches everywhere, in rock formations, in shadows, in the wavering heat distortions of the desert. Nervous sentries fired at coyotes, tumbleweeds, their own imagination. The stress of hunting an enemy who could strike anywhere at any time, who seemed to know your movements before you made them, who could vanish from ground you had under direct observation, broke stronger men than combat ever did. Mexican forces weren't faring any better. One Mexican column of 300 soldiers tracked Geronimo's band to a narrow canyon and positioned themselves to block both ends. They waited all night, certain they had finally trapped the famous Apache leader. At sunrise, they cautiously entered the canyon to find evidence of a recent camp, and a note left on a stick written in Spanish. "You were very close this time. Better luck next." The note was signed with Geronimo's handprint. But perhaps the most frustrating thing for military commanders was that they knew Geronimo wasn't superhuman. He was 56 years old, traveling with elderly relatives, pregnant women, and small children. His warriors were armed with outdated rifles and limited ammunition. They had no supply lines, no reinforcements, no safe bases of operation. By every conventional measure, they should have been captured or killed within weeks. Instead, they led 8,000 troops on a chase that covered thousands of miles, cost the American and Mexican governments millions of dollars, and made Geronimo's name known throughout the world. Newspaper correspondents followed the campaign, sending dispatches about the mysterious Apache leader who could apparently walk through walls and fly over mountains. The truth was both simpler and more profound than the newspaper accounts suggested. Geronimo and his followers weren't defying the laws of nature. They were following laws that were far older and more fundamental than anything taught at West Point. They moved with the rhythm of the land itself, reading signs in cloud formations and bird flight that told them where their enemies were and where safety lay. They understood that true invisibility wasn't about magic. It was about patience, timing, and knowing the landscape so intimately that you could become part of it. When Apache warriors vanished in open country, they weren't disappearing. They were using micro-terrain features, shadows, and stillness so perfectly that they became indistinguishable from the rocks and brush around them. But all things must end, even the most impossible campaigns. As 1886 wore on, the constant pursuit began to take its toll. Apache bands were scattered, families separated, traditional gathering places no longer safe. The net was slowly tightening, not through any brilliant military strategy, but through simple exhaustion and attrition. And in September of 1886, at a place called Skeleton Canyon, one of the most remarkable guerrilla campaigns in military history would finally come to an end. But even in surrender, Geronimo would prove that the Apache ability to vanish was far from finished. September 4th, 1886, Skeleton Canyon, Arizona Territory. After more than a year of pursuit that had covered thousands of miles and involved thousands of troops, Geronimo finally walked into General Nelson Miles' camp under a white flag. The last Indian War in American history was officially over. But as we'll see, the story of the vanishing warriors was far from finished. The surrender itself was almost anticlimactic. Here was the man who had terrified two nations, who had made the United States Army look foolish in front of the world press, who had become the most famous Apache in history. And he looked ordinary, middle-aged, weathered, tired. Not the supernatural figure of newspaper accounts, but a man who had finally reached the end of an impossible road. General Miles had promised Geronimo that if he surrendered, his people would be allowed to return to a reservation in Arizona after a brief exile in the East. It was a lie, though Miles may not have known it at the time. The decision had already been made at the highest levels of government. Every Apache, men, women, children, even the scouts who had helped the army track Geronimo, would be loaded onto trains as prisoners of war and shipped as far from Arizona as possible. 450 Chiricahua Apaches were herded onto cattle cars in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for livestock. They were told they were going to Florida for a short time, just until the situation in Arizona cooled down. Instead, they were about to begin a 27-year odyssey that would take them from the humid swamps of Florida to the disease-ridden barracks of Alabama, watching their children die of tuberculosis and their elders waste away from heartbreak. The government's plan was simple: destroy Apache culture completely. Children were separated from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man. They were forbidden to speak Apache, forbidden to practice traditional ceremonies, forbidden to even use their Apache names. The idea was that when these children grew up, they would be indistinguishable from white Americans, and the Apache problem would solve itself through cultural genocide. But here's what the government didn't understand about the people they were trying to erase: the ability to become invisible, to preserve essential knowledge while appearing to surrender it completely, was built into the very core of Apache culture. If you can hide from cavalry in open desert, you can certainly hide your traditions from boarding school teachers. Even in the humid hell of Florida, even in the barracks of Alabama, where Apache families died by the dozens from diseases their immune systems had never encountered, the old ways persisted like underground streams. Elderly warriors taught young boys the ancient techniques in secret, drawing maps in the dirt that were quickly erased, whispering stories of which plants could sustain a man for days, how to find water by watching birds, how to read the mood of the sky. Mothers would hum traditional songs while washing clothes, embedding the melodies so deeply in their children's memories that decades later, those same children would remember every note. Grandmothers told stories that seemed like simple fairy tales to the white teachers who occasionally overheard them, but which were actually encoded lessons in survival, navigation, and the sacred geography of the homeland they had been torn from. Apache prisoners became masters of a different kind of invisibility, the ability to maintain their identity while appearing to assimilate. They learned English and Christianity, wore white man's clothes and cut their hair, but underneath the surface transformation, the essential Apache knowledge remained intact, waiting when tuberculosis and despair finally moved the government to relocate the surviving Apaches to Oklahoma in 1894, and then to allow some to return to New Mexico reservations in 1913. Something remarkable happened. After 27 years of deliberate cultural destruction, after losing more than half their population to disease and heartbreak, the Apache people still remembered who they were. The knowledge that had allowed warriors to vanish in the Dragoon Mountains hadn't vanished itself. It had simply gone underground, like the hidden springs that had sustained Apache resistance for so many years. Modern Apache people today maintain many of these traditions, not as museum pieces or tourist attractions, but as living practices that continue to shape their relationship with the land. Apache firefighters working for the Forest Service use traditional tracking skills to predict wildfire behavior, reading signs in vegetation and topography that sophisticated computer models miss. They understand how fire moves through different terrains, which way the wind will shift based on mountain formations, where to place fire breaks that work with the land's natural patterns rather than against them. At Fort Huachuca, Arizona, ironically built on lands where Cochise once rode, military special forces study Apache tactics as part of their survival training. They learn techniques for moving undetected through hostile territory, for finding water in desert environments, for reading tracks and signs that most people would never notice. The same knowledge that once frustrated generations of army officers is now being taught to their successors. The Apache practice of becoming invisible hasn't vanished. It has evolved. In ceremony and story, in the teaching of children to observe nature with patience their ancestors would recognize, in the fight to protect sacred sites from development and mining, the spirit that allowed warriors to melt into the landscape lives on. Visit an Apache reservation today, and you'll see something that would be familiar to Geronimo or Cochise. Children learning to move quietly through brush, to identify plants and their uses, to read the subtle signs that tell you when you're being watched. They may be wearing modern clothes and speaking English, but they're also learning skills that connect them directly to warriors who once made the United States Army question the laws of physics. The sacred mountains are still there, the dragoons where Cochise made his stronghold, the Chiricahuas where Geronimo learned to fight, the countless other peaks and canyons where Apache warriors perfected the art of becoming one with the landscape. And Apache people still visit these places, still perform ceremonies that acknowledge the connection between the people and the land that shaped them, the generals who couldn't believe their eyes when Apache warriors vanished into thin air were witnessing something more than military tactics, more than clever use of terrain. They were seeing a people so connected to their homeland that they could become indistinguishable from it. A power that transcended any weapon technology could devise. That power, the ability to preserve what is essential while adapting to impossible circumstances, to remain invisible when necessary, while never losing sight of who you are, proved more durable than any army. It survived concentration camps and boarding schools, disease and heartbreak, decades of deliberate attempts to destroy it completely, and perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about the Apache story. In a world where so much has been lost, where so many indigenous cultures have been scattered to the winds, the people who once vanished from under the very noses of 8,000 soldiers have managed something even more impressive. They have remained themselves, hidden in plain sight, keepers of knowledge that the modern world is only beginning to understand it desperately needs. The last Apache War may have ended at Skeleton Canyon in 1886, but the Apache way of seeing the world, the understanding that true strength comes from learning to move in harmony with forces larger than yourself, continues to this day. The warriors may have surrendered their rifles, but they never surrendered the vision that made them invisible in the first place. And in a world that seems determined to make everything visible, trackable and predictable, perhaps there's something profound to be learned from people who understood that the most important things are often the ones you cannot see.